My name is Russell Binder. I'm the principal of Stryker Entertainment. The folks you just listened to in the previous panel run a similar business than I do, but they're more internal people. We have an external agency that represents intellectual property rights holders from film studios, television studios, and broadcasters, and video game companies. So clients of ours include AMC and The Walking Dead, Sony Television from Preacher and The Tick. We have Five Nights at Freddy's, we do Candy Crush, we do Dead by Daylight, we represent Universal Cable Productions. So a wide range of IP from film, television, and gaming into all areas of consumer products.
Hey guys, I'm Louis-Rene Auclair. I used to run a studio in Montreal called Hibernam. Unfortunately, it has gone under. Past August now, I run RocketJump Games. Our main line of business was doing licensed games, so we did a lot of work with Lego, with Disney, Wizards of the Coast on Magic the Gathering. So my perspective is more on the developer side, where we did a lot of deals with these big brand owners.
Great. And my name is Patrick Sweeney. I'm the founder of the Interactive Entertainment Law Group, which is the largest video game specific law practice in the United States. I've probably done 50 to 75 licenses for film, television, and entertainment properties into games and out of games, including Universal, Warner Brothers, Marvel, Disney, Paramount, Lionsgate, more than I can name. So, so again, obviously we're going to talk about more on the legal side, and I think the interesting dynamic we have here between Russell and Louis is that one tends to be on the licensor side, one tends to be on the licensee side, so we're going to get their perspectives on how they approach the contract. Again, the prior panel talked a lot about choosing the property and why you want to work with licensors, which was great, and it's a nice lead-in, but then the question sort of becomes, now what? Obviously, I think in all of my years doing this, I've only seen a licensee draft the license agreement once, and that was a very sort of small and unsophisticated licensor. But beyond that, it's the early stage of the negotiation becomes more for these guys to deal with, and I'd love to get their perspectives on where you go now that you've decided that you want to work together from a production standpoint. You have the same vision on a game. What's next? I mean, you mean about dealing the contract, or? Yeah, the business points. How do you start talking about the business points? Who throws out the numbers first? Who sort of has that sensibility?
You always want to have them throw out the numbers. You never want to jump in first.
I'd say the same exact thing, by the way.
Yes. So don't dive in and say, this is what I'm willing to give you. Deals on licenses are so special and so different. There's MGs involved, there's approvals involved. They have also a perspective of the value of their IP. The value of their IP in their minds will change depending on the push they're getting from the head office and the higher-ups in their companies. So always let them jump in the water first, figure out what they're looking for, what they really want, and then that's going to set the points. If you jump in first, you're just going to be in a position to move up instead of move down, and it's never a good one.
I'm going to say complete opposite of you. Coming from the rights holder's perspective, there's two options usually when you engage in a licensing agreement. You either have one party that you're doing business with, and that one party is who you're negotiating a deal with, and you're trying to determine value of the intellectual property and the licensing fee and the rates and the rev share and all that good stuff. Or as a rights holder, you're going to the marketplace of all the different publishers and financiers, and you're letting the market sort of dictate what the value of the property is from a value perspective. And then you start getting proposals and offers, and that will sort of set the tone of where the industry feels the value of the marketplace is for the IP.
Does the common perception, and a lot of my licensee clients in these deals over the years have basically come to the table with the attitude of, well, there's not a whole lot of room to negotiate these. We're sort of at the mercy of the licensor. Can you guys talk a little bit about the leverage that the licensor has and why they have it? Obviously, the primary concern is protecting their brand, But what, how much movement is there in some of these deals, just from a big picture perspective?
I would say it highly depends on the IP you're talking about. If somebody approaches Russell for The Walking Dead, all the leverage is in his hands. If somebody approaches Disney for Marvel or Star Wars, they have all the leverage in the world. But if you can find that special evergreen, that little like IP that nobody really talks about, but you have something special for it, I think you have a lot of more leverage, and that's what you should be looking for if you're a small-ish developer. If you're a big publisher with a lot of money, you're going to go for the AAA, but you're not going to be dictating the terms of the deal. So that my approach is either you find that IP that's special to you and that, is in your mind the best IP you can work with, or if you go for AAA, just go on for the ride.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, every game is different. Every game monetizes differently. Every platform monetizes differently. So it's hard to have a set number in your mind as to what the value of the property, the deal making, or your leverage is, because a developer may come to you with a free-to-play runner that doesn't monetize, but they're going to give you a fee to do it, and there's going to be probably no additional fee earned beyond that. Or there's a console title or a VR title, and every one of them has a marketplace that has a benchmark of what's a success, what's a mid-level success, and what's really a non-success. So you can look at what the comps are in performance and then start basing your negotiations on really what we think the marketplace will evolve to, and ultimately, again, what your MG is also sometimes depends on, and your MG is your minimum guarantee, on the rev share you determine. Sometimes, there are smaller developers who are willing to pay a higher back end or rev share because they don't have the resources up front to pay larger sums of guarantees and advances. And their attitude is, let's be partners, we're going to give you a bigger upside in success, but we're not going to give it to you up front. Whereas other publishers who have more resources might say, look, we're going to put a big chunk of dough on the table up front, but we're going to keep you at a royalty rate or a rev share that's consistent with where we're comfortable based on all of our other kind of factors of deal making. So again, in the old days, it was so easy. You had 7 publishers who came to you with big checks and you made deals. Now it's all over the place, and there really is no standard, I don't think.
Yeah, no, obviously I agree with you, Russell. I think that the deals I'm seeing are far more creative because you have a lot more licensees that are able to come to that table than there used to be 5-10 years ago. Right. I still think at the end of the day, the licensor holds most of the cards and holds the leverage. Obviously, we're going to talk about how that leverage is deployed in a few other areas in the next couple of slides. So negotiation strategy, again, that ties back to the leverage. Each party talks about what's important to them. Is it the flexibility to make the game you want to make from the licensee's perspective? Is it making sure the brand is protected from the licensor perspective? Louis, will you talk a little bit about what's important to you coming as a developer, licensee? What's important to you in these deals? Obviously, the financial component is always important, but beyond that.
I think I'll talk for the small and medium-sized developer publisher, I think what's really important to you is to leverage the power of the brand. So although your goal is to be passionately making a game that perfectly represents the IP, you want that IP to have some sort, the IP owner to have some sort of guarantee of what they're going to do for you. One of the games we did at Hibernum was for the Bruce Lee IP. And when we signed this deal, they already had 20 million likes and followers on Facebook. So what was important to us was them to actually do social posts and work with us on the marketing at launch. Have actually Bruce Lee's daughter, Shannon, do a full video and talk about the game, the fact that it's the only first mobile endorsed game by Bruce Lee. So when you're a small developer and publisher, what you want the leverage. You want to use their fan base to the maximum to maximize your user acquisition, minimize your spend. So that's why you spend money on that IP.
And I think, again, there's always a harmony in deal making. And on the one hand, if you're a proactive rights holder and you have resources to message your fan base as to what you're doing in gaming, it's a huge advantage as opposed to a rights holder who's like, sorry, publisher, developer, you're on your own. You spend the marketing bucks. We can't guarantee you a mention on a social post. We can't guarantee you a link on a movie poster. And all of a sudden, you're sort of an island, and the rights holders like, just count on it. We're marketing this motion picture. We're spending $40 million in marketing. That's what we're doing. That's our engagement. Again, the landscape's changing a little bit, and I think also the way game development is now becoming part of a daily conversation between the gamer and the developer as the games are being developed, and that's part of a marketing initiative. But it's important that the rights holder gives and that the developer also and the publisher are willing to make marketing commitments, because again, in today's environment, with user acquisition being sort of the secret sauce of a great game, and a perfect storm, a great game and a great marketing budget working, you need both working together. And if you have a great game and no marketing spend, you're going to get lost unless you're a fluke and the socialization, like with perfect examples of property we work on, which defies all the logic, is Five Nights at Freddy's, which is one developer, one man making a game in his garage or his den. But he put it out, and the next thing you know is that the social, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Reddit, all of a sudden there was this kind of organic build behind this property that had no marketing, no budget, and probably cost $20,000 to make, and became a huge sensation. That doesn't work that way every time. You really need commitments across the board in marketing from both sides.
Yeah, and on top of that, I would say the other thing that you really want to look for is how much freedom you have on the creative side. Back in the 90s, the first IP games that you would see were always like retelling the story of the movie in the game. And that showed that it doesn't work basically. So if you're gonna do an IP game, if you're gonna get a license, you have to have some sort of creative freedom, not be forced to do the story of the movie or the TV show, and actually be able to expand that universe. There's so many people playing mobile games or PC and console games right now that the licensor, the guy giving you the license, should be able to see that the fact that you're going to open creatively his IP is good for him, and it's going to create more people, more eyeballs on his overall brand. So creative freedom, in as much as you can, is really important to get as well as a developer.
When we license a T-shirt, we provide a pre-approved graphic to a T-shirt manufacturer. They put it on a garment. They show it to us for approval. We say it looks great. You're using the art we gave you. The colors are right. Approved. Simple. A video game is anywhere from an 8 to 18 month to 2 year investment cycle of development time, and approvals work a lot differently in gaming, particularly, as you say, when you want to go beyond the scope of what exists in the intellectual property that's being exposed in its media format. So it gets complicated, particularly when you've got filmmakers involved and writers involved and directors involved, and all of a sudden they might not want to give away a story point because they want to leave it available for themselves for a sequel, or they're going to do a spin-off, and it gets really sometimes complicated to be as creative as you possibly can be in gaming, but it's critical to be creative. So the fewer layers of approvals and the more access you have to the actual talent making the product is valuable. And I will say that at the studio level, a lot of the rights holders are getting much more sophisticated, I think, in who's doing their game business. They're not hiring just random people to make a deal and have no ability to have a dialogue with the developer of how to make the game and how to integrate the IP into the game. Now there are folks like Daniel in the back, as an example, who actually have a daily dialogue with the game developers, introduce what is important in the DNA of the IP to the developer, but they understand how to speak the language, as opposed to, it doesn't look right, or I don't have good feedback for you because I don't know what you're doing. So that's also important to have someone who speaks video game.
Yeah, they used to sort of, the buzzword around these deals 5-10 years ago was, we're entering into a partnership. Well, the contract certainly didn't look like partnerships in any meaningful way. But I think what Louis is suggesting creatively, you want to be left alone, more or less, so you can make the game that you want to make. but you also want to have that partnership participation as far as the marketing and the co-branding. Can that be a tough line to sort of draw in the middle? Because on one level you're saying, stay away, let me make the game, but on the other level you're saying, come on board, I need your help.
Yeah, it's always difficult, right? And this is very depending of the relationship with the IP owner. The more experienced the IP owner is in the gaming industry, the less problem you're going to have with that point.
Right.
It turns back also to approvals, right? How do they use their approvals within the contract? But for me, I mean, the more sophisticated the brand owner, the easier it is to get that great balance of creative freedom and marketing providing.
I'm going to state the obvious. A lot of rights holders have general counsel, they have lawyers internally who have familiarity with talent deals or writer deals or distribution deals, who have no real understanding of the nuances of a game deal. And one of the things that we always recommend to our clients is, if you do not have internal expertise, please hire someone who actually speaks video game licensing deals, because you're going to want that protection. You're going to want to think about the things you're not normally thinking about in your licensing agreements with other manufacturers in the hard goods space. There's just factors that you're not going to think about. So that is critical. And you brought up a good point. I'm trying to remember what my thought was to add to it, but it is a dance. You know, when you're taking someone's intellectual property and affecting it or adding to it, there's a sensitivity to the rights holder. They don't want their brand damaged. They're going to do everything they can to protect the downside of a poor product being introduced into the marketplace. You don't want to dent the IP with product that you're not proud of. And that's, you know, you can't always guarantee, like you could put the best director, the best cast on a movie and the movie's going to still suck. You can't guarantee the end result, but you do your best during the process to manage that relationship. And it is a fine line, because there's things that the developer really needs, like to pull off to make the game work in the game world, that a filmmaker or a studio might not understand, because it doesn't align. I love that this story is, when we were doing Twilight back in the day, we had an opportunity to do a game, and Stephanie Meyer, who wrote the book, was really uncomfortable or not terribly familiar with video gaming, and we wanted to have Jacob ride a motorcycle and he'd get past a certain level through these obstacles, and if he fell off the bike, you'd have to start over. And she's like, but that doesn't happen in the book. So that we can't have that in the game. So she basically wanted a three-dimensional video game version of the movie, and that just wouldn't have been interesting. So it takes time for people to adapt and understand how their rights are applied and what makes it interactive.
That actually ties perfectly into the next slide, is the grant of rights. So in these contracts, you're fleshing out specifically what rights the licensee has and what they don't. You know, are you following the movie? Are you retelling that story? Or are you forbidden to tell that story? Or can you use certain characters and others that are forbidden? So can you guys talk a little bit about some of your experiences in that sense? Sort of fleshing out what you can and can't do, and how much interaction you have with the rights holders, the people behind the rights holders, the Stephanie Meyers, for example.
You know, I think one thing is important is, if you're going to commit a year and a half of your organization to building a game, you need to make sure that the rights you have satisfy your objectives. And you bring up Marvel and Disney and other rights holders, and I think this came up in the previous panel. In some cases, there can be an oversaturation or an over-licensing of an IP, and you are only getting certain aspects of it, or you're out there competing in a similar genre. You got to be really careful to make sure that you carve out a space that you can operate within, that you have best case limited competition. I mean, I think it's okay to have a mobile and a console and a VR exercise, because they're all sort of their own verticals, but you want to be careful, if you're a mobile developer, how many mobile games are going at the same time. So that exclusivity point is really important. Most rights holders tend not to want to give you exclusivity, because they don't want to lock up their opportunities and prevent themselves from new things that they might not have considered, or that they consider safe zones from what you're developing. So you're generally going for non-exclusive with a spirit of protection. Exclusivity tends to be granted when big checks are written. That's what I'm typically used to. So we're going to pay for our protection. it's sort of like mafiosa.
That spirit of exclusivity doesn't always make it into the contract,
No.
though, which is always a challenge. But,
You know.
but yeah, no, you're exactly right. It depends on the property. It depends on how narrowly you can define the channel or the platform for that exclusivity. If it's broad-based, it's going to be less likely. But if it's one mobile game or one VR game over a period of time, maybe you can get it, or even in a particular genre.
Right.
Yeah, I think the brand rules are very important. I mean, you do a deal with Stryker, you look at The Walking Dead. I mean, it's a perfect example, right? Is it the comic? Is it the TV show? So then the likenesses are going to be different. You cannot, if you get the license for the Walking Dead comic, you cannot use the actor that does Rick, or you cannot even have Daryl in it because he's not in the comic books, right? So those are things that you need to be aware of while making your deal. I mean, with Bruce Lee, we had this thing that, I mean, Bruce Lee is actually a human being, right? He's not only an IP, he's actually the person. And one of the rules of the IP owner, which is the family, they were saying never show drinking or using booze or drugs, and never hitting women. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, so when you make a game that's about fighting, you have to remember this. I mean, you're not going to do him fighting a bunch of women in a bar. But I mean, you don't think about that sometimes, right? You know you're going to be respectful of the brand, but there's those specific rules that you have to be wary of. When we're working with Lego, you could not show a Lego construction that was not offered in store, and if you did, you actually had to have the same look and feel. So if you showed the police station from Lego City, for example, it would have to be exactly the same as it is in the toys. So then you think about this and you're like, okay, they have circle prongs on top of every block. How are you going to render perfectly circle blocked on a zoom in, zoom out game? And when you have 10,000 circle blocks on top of it, it's impossible. So you have to think about those things. You have to be aware of the rules. The brand Bible is very important when you go into that. So on the development side, you have to be extremely careful of these things because that can change your entire strategy and scope.
Yeah, I think the superhero license, the brands are probably the most granular as far as those goes. You're talking about which Spider-Man you're using, which costume. Is it Miles Morales? Is it Peter Parker? Which character, which villains you can use, which ones you can't. All that ties into when the movies are coming out and holdback windows as far as some of that, particularly in the multi-character games that are out there. So having to navigate that happens at this stage because that's what you're paying for from a brand perspective. You don't want to find out you're paying millions of dollars and you only get this one sliver of Miles Morales Spider-Man wearing this costume, and you can't use any of the main characters that you want in the storyline. So I think this is the stage where you have to hash that out.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of great relationships established between rights holders and publishers and developers before the game goes into development because everybody wants to do business together. But then at the end of the day, there's a creative disalignment, I guess is the right word, where shit, we didn't think about that, or we have this idea for the game and you have this idea for the game, and nothing gets done. There's a lot of friction. So getting creatively aligned as much as feasibly possible before any deals are concluded is really a wise way to go, because if you get the deal done, money's changed hands, and all of a sudden you're not getting any approvals, you're going to lose a lot of time, a lot of money, and get a lot of frustration. I'm looking at the slide here also, and just kind of looking at some of these other contractual terms that we deal with. There's the length of term, which is on there. You got to take into consideration what you're developing, how long it takes you to develop, and how long a rights holder is going to want you to have their rights for, and try to figure out the perfect length of time with potential options to extend or automatic renewals. But you got to build in your development time plus a couple of years at least to monetize that which you've developed. So, term is really important. Territory, I think Gary or someone mentioned this earlier about your game might have value, or your IP might have value in one territory, but not another. Most people want worldwide rights because you want to amortize the game and monetize it globally. There's also unique challenges in certain territories about content and subject matter. as well as, like for example, the China of it all, and having to work with like a developer or a publisher that is Chinese to get a game distributed. So oftentimes rights holders here are reserving China when they do global deals because they need to have that option to do something specific for the territory. There's a really good point on there. Platforms, multiple games. Like, what platforms are you licensing? It's not just video games. You've got to be hyper specific. If it's a mobile game and you have anticipation, you're going to do multiple different mobile games, a mid-core, casual. You better be specific in your negotiations on both sides so you know what areas you're working with. Do you want a blast radius? If I'm going to go out and market your game, I need to have some room to be exclusively marketing that game, because I don't want someone trailing me or, drafting and cycling, drafting off of all my marketing investment and getting to launch a game simultaneously to the person or the company that's investing heavily in the marketing their title.
Yeah, I've seen a few deals now that are starting to actually be reversed. Rather than have the brand give exclusivity, they're saying it's non-exclusive, but we'll give you a window where we won't have anything else out there like yours, and maybe in a very sort of confined, in a mobile match 3 genre, for example. But still, at least you're getting a little bit of a window as a licensee to be alone in the marketplace. So I'm starting to see a little bit there because they're hesitant to give full exclusivity anyway.
Right. Release windows, I think you just brought that up. Music, sometimes the rights holder owns the music, sometimes they don't. So if you're a developer, if the music isn't going to be provided to you, you need to think budgetarily how I have to license that music, I have to pay a licensing fee for it, or I'm going to have to hire an orchestra or a musician to recreate that music or do sound alike so it's similar to what we're familiar with, but not exact, so that we can use something that the fans and the lovers of the IP are familiar with. Talent and voice likenesses.
We're going through that now a little bit on a deal on the talent side. Yeah. The deal's all done, everything's ready. Oh wait, we want to get that particular actor's likeness and voiceover. Well, that's not included. So that the licensee's got to cut a side deal there. They've got to make sure that economically it all still fits within what they're trying to do on top of the brand itself. Usually it's not a problem, but it's not usually included, right? And it depends. I mean, obviously, do you want to do a Wonder Woman video game and not have Gal Gadot's likeness and voiceover, or do you want to do a generic Wonder Woman depiction? I mean, these are the kinds of things you have to deal with, and all of that is negotiated. And like I said before, it even gets as granular as the costumes and the storylines and the genres. Approvals. So this is, I think, where I personally spend probably the most time on these deals, is dealing with the approval standards between the brand owners and the licensees. Louis, talk a little bit about what is difficult to get approval on, or what is sort of expected from your perspective.
Yeah, so approvals are probably the biggest point, right? When you've negotiated the likeness, the music, the characters, and all of a sudden you have all those side deals going, everybody gets to approve them. One of the good stories that I have to tell about this, we did the game for Disney, actually, so it's a perfect location to talk about this. We did the Disney Infinity Action. And it was you could film yourself with Disney characters. And then all of a sudden we're doing Jack Skellington from The Nightmare Before Christmas, and you realize the character is owned by Tim Burton. So you do all your animations, but he has to approve them. So all of a sudden you're in a complete different world of, you're no longer talking to the same guy, somebody else has to approve it. What's his ability to understand the video game market? We were lucky in that front because Tim's team was really good at approvals. But sometimes you'll get in a position that you're never going to get something approved, and it's extremely difficult, or the requirements for approval just don't work in a video games way. So the more deep you go in a brand, the more likeness, music, characters you negotiate, the deeper you're going to have to go in approvals. And if you're really tied down to a specific launch date, this is going to hurt really, really bad, because it takes time. It takes a lot of time to gather all these people, get those approval. So, I mean, you're never going to get out of it, though. There's no way you're going to make a deal on an IP and they don't get approval. The negotiation factor of if you don't respond in 14 days, it's deemed approved will never work.
Right.
Nobody will approve to that ever. So it's almost a moot point in negotiations, but the deeper you go, you have to be aware, the longer the
I think you bring up a good point, Louis, that the more layers of approval and the more people that have to approve, and obviously the more items you have to get approved, really impacts any deadlines you have on release windows, on hitting an alpha and a beta and things along those lines. So that's where I always try to build in the most flexibility on the dates if there's a heavy layer of approvals. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, that tends to be an area of friction in an agreement, is that deemed approved or deemed disapproved over a period of time, because developers can't be hamstrung, but they never win the argument of, because you don't own the IP, you'll never win the argument of it's deemed approved if you don't respond or give an approval within a 14, 15-day window. But the challenge sometimes is that, again, sometimes people don't even know what they're approving on the rights holder side. So there tends to be, it's a good idea to build these kind of development milestones and walk the rights holder through what those milestones are, so that they know that in the first month and a half, we're going to develop a game concept document that's going to be the game, and this is the mechanic, and this is the objective. Do you approve? And if it's approved, the idea in the contract is that downstream, the rights holder can't come back and say not approved. You've already approved it. You've already agreed to this, because there could be a turnover in the department of the video game side on the rights holder, where a new body comes in and says, no, I don't like that anymore. Well, it's already been approved. So you have to protect yourselves, so you can't work backwards. One of the other areas that gets kind of tenuous in an agreement is who owns what at the end of the day, because this always comes up in licensing agreements, which is we're the rights holder, we own our intellectual property. Anything you create using our intellectual property is ours. You can use it in your game, but you don't own it. And developers are like, but we own our tech, and we own this, and if we build a tree that's not in your game or not in your universe, and it's our model, we want to keep that tree. I mean, it's a simple example, but again, it always works itself out, but generally developers never get to own anything that's touching on the toenails of the rights holder, but you own your tech.
Yeah, the other thing that personally I like to do on the licensee side, it doesn't always necessarily work, is spreading that minimum guarantee out so that there's an incentive for the licensor to process these approvals. If they've already gotten paid everything on the minimum guarantee side, then the licensee worries that they're going to be held up a little bit because there's no sort of incentive for approval. But yeah, this is definitely an area where we spend a lot of time in the deal. Marketing is probably one of the other areas. So normally the licensee is expected to have some sort of marketing commitment, some sort of minimum activity that they're going to do. The licensor, you'd like them to contractually commit to do some things as well to help the game, but that isn't usually something that they're willing to be contractually bound by to the same degree, which Russell talked a little bit about earlier. Louis, obviously the marketing side of what your obligations are becomes pretty expensive in a UA spend scenario. Can you talk a little bit about the marketing component of the license deals you've been involved with?
Yeah, I think the marketing component, you always want to try to mix and match the marketing of the IP you're working on. For Wizards of the Coast, for example, they were releasing cards every 3 months. So every time a new set of cards for Magic the Gathering was coming out, we wanted to have a joint marketing effort. So that's one thing, but you will always be required a higher quality IP, the more AAA it is. They will not only ask how much money you're going to spend on the game, what's the game concept, but how much money are you going to spend on marketing my game. And those commitments are pretty hard, so the higher the value, perceived value of the IP, the more money you're going to have to commit up front. But you need to find a way to get commitment from the IP owner to give you some sort of marketing. That's why I tended to try to go for evergreen IPs. We've done some deals with new IP, and you so have to be linked to the release window of the movie or whatever you're doing, that it's extremely difficult when you link approvals, when you link all that to a release window and time, right? I mean, you're making a game on a new IP, you don't even know the end of the movie before you're finishing your game. So all these things have to be taken into consideration. My feedback on this would be take an IP that's as evergreen as possible, so you don't have to be linked to a specific date for the release. and try to get them some commitment from them, try to match their marketing and do this together, but it's very difficult.
Years ago, when I was seeing a lot more deals with on the licensing side with, say, Disney or Warner Brothers, they would actually designate where you would spend that marketing. So X% had to be spent on a Disney-owned television channel or whatever. I don't see that as much anymore. Are you guys still seeing those kind of deals where they're really getting granular?
Marvel, when you'd have to advertise, or DC in the comic books, but I haven't seen that as much being obligated to. I mean, with one of our clients who owns a television broadcaster mechanism to communicate to they'll not only have a social channel, but they have a television station, and if you're a sophisticated, motivated licensor and you have these resources and you can justify the investment, there's a return on investment to advertise on television, as an example, your game, you're going to see a huge return on that investment if the game is monetizing. So that's a great situation when that exists, and that tends to exist more in television because motion pictures, you don't own the theaters, and so you can't control how those, and more often than not, the advertising for movies is the movie advertisement. It's not the game advertisement. And one of the kind of things that comes up a lot with developers and publishers who've never licensed before, or at least never licensed anything with characters or actors, which we deal with, is the assumption is the rights holder owns the actor. They own the character. They don't own the actor. So you can't say, "Hey, could you get Hugh Jackman to do like a social post for us, or sit, do a video promoting the game?" It's like, here's Hugh's agent. You call him and you negotiate a deal to get Hugh to do that, and you pay him because he's not obligated to do it. Some actors will do it, but for the most part, they make money by being paid for their services. They'll get a back end if their likeness is used in most agreements, but that's not their sole source.
Yeah, that depends on sort of the visibility of that character and the importance to the particular game. So, yeah. But I want to move on. We're starting to run a little short on time, and we want to leave time for questions. So I want to talk a little bit now about the financial component. Obviously, we've talked about the minimum guarantee and the installments and its recoupability, the royalty split, obviously, and the reporting frequency and detail. So Louis, obviously, you want to get as much deducted as possible of your expenses. What do you normally see out there in the deals you were doing on Hypernum?
I mean, it was so flexible. It's so different, right? I mean, you can my feedback would be always try to negotiate an MG that's as far down the line as possible. People who want money up front, you're always worried that if you give too much money to the IP owner up front, he's gonna make his money, right? He's not gonna help you out. So it's a very difficult one. My instance is what I see is that the IP owner gets paid regardless. So it's very difficult to deduct UA before you pay him. He's gonna make his money. So your first months when you launch a game and you really wanna push that marketing, he's probably gonna get a check and you're not. So it's a pretty sweet business you guys have. You get money all the time, and sometimes profitability is on the IP owner side, and as a developer publisher, you're gonna see your profits much further down the line.
You sound a little bitter.
What?
You sound a little bit bitter.
Yeah, I'm not bitter at all.
No, but you did some creative deals at Hibernum where you would sort of, as you mentioned, trade off a little bit of lower MGs for better back end. And so how did that work for you, and how amenable were the brands to that?
We were very flexible. So we had some co-dev deals where we actually did not pay any MG, and we would get a very strong IP. And so it depends. I think it's more and more open. What you bring to the table is your game, your ability to monetize it. If it's not a AAA IP, you can negotiate that. You can be really creative with the deal. But if you're talking about, The Simpsons, Family Guy, The Walking Dead, Marvel, you're not going to get out of it. You're going to write a big check at the beginning.
I think as a developer or publisher, you're really looking for, and a rights holder too, mitigating risk. And to your point, kind of extending out the advance or the guarantee payments over the course of development is one way to do that. But when it comes to recouping costs of development or not, or marketing or not, that net profit definition on what royalties and rev shares are based on are really important for both sides. So oftentimes a developer will say, look, we're spending $1.5 million on development. We want to recover that before we start paying you a royalty. Well, most rights holders are saying that's your risk. You don't get to recoup any of your development costs, but you can recoup some of your marketing expenses against the rev share or returns if it's a physical product or other things. But that tension in the negotiation of what rev share and royalties are based on is where you need to spend a lot of time making and finessing what makes sense for your business so you don't find yourself in harm's way.
And now I want to skip this slide. I mean, the boilerplate is important. That's something that we spend a good amount of time on. The breach termination scenarios are really probably the one where you can move the most, or at least the contract's going to vary. But I want to move on to some questions here for Russell and Louis. What do you see as the future of licensed games and licensors? Is it becoming more collaborative? And I think I know what your answer is going to be. But what do you see coming on that?
Look, I see a combination of things. I see the bigger entities who've got the resources look at interactive and gaming as an extension of their storytelling. So they're becoming less inclined to just purely license and more inclined to partner or finance and be their own publisher in some instances, because it is a tributary off of their intellectual property and they want to control all aspects of that storytelling. There's a lot of rights holders who don't have those resources, however, so licensing still becomes very important. But again, we're still trying to figure out, with all the dust settling, what is the best avenue to take your intellectual property direction into from a gaming perspective, what platform. Are there enough companies out there that can even finance their own games, or where does this outside financing come from? It's just really become a bit of the Wild West. So with VR, AR, mobile, console, PC, and whatever else is coming down the pipe, it's getting interesting.
Louis, I want to ask the same question of you. Obviously, you're coming at it from a different perspective, and I think a unique perspective, because Hibernum was very creative, did a lot of licensed properties, but ultimately that didn't work for Hibernum. Yeah. So what do you see as the future?
I see the more discoverability is going to be an issue. The more difficult it is to get your game noticed, the bigger share the IP owner are going to get. I mean, in consoles, PC, I don't see IPs really thriving, but on mobile, it's going to continue to thrive. I think that AR and VR is going to be pretty strong as well with the power of the brands. So I see those brands thriving there. And when you look at the install base on mobile, there's so many people with mobile phones playing games that you're going to see some niche properties making some really strong success, because, I mean, how many phones are there? 3 billion? I don't know. There's so much install base that you can have a game on Garfield and make money. I mean, you saw Jam City make money on the Book of the Dead from Sony. And that was not about the IP. It was about a great game that turns out to be about an IP. So I see the discoverability issues in the markets being directly linked to the power of the brands in those specific markets.
I certainly see the deals changing to reflect that more collaborative, more open-ended ended process. But I guess the question is, are the studios, are the brand owners, do they have the right people in place to, and it's probably a loaded question, in place to actually be more game producers and collaborative, or are they just sort of trying to repurpose the old approval people with the thumbs up, thumbs down on pencils and T-shirts? I mean, are they getting there?
I think it's more and more collaborative, and you see, especially in Hollywood and the movie industry, you see all studios really diving deep into their ability to work with people that do their IP. So I see a more collaboration coming forward. I see people with more games experience working at these studios, helping you make better games. So I think it's in a great position because of that. But it will extremely depend of the studio. I mean, yeah. Some are going all in. Some are, NBC Universal, for example, Fox, Disney are really strong with their games team. Some are starting to build those, and you see the difference in the product that ships.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the panel. It's been really informative. Quick question. What happens, or what issues come up when the parties to a deal are international? In other words, maybe the licensor is in Hollywood, but the licensee is in Korea or China or what kind of stuff comes up, and how do you navigate through the issues?
That's a really good question.
Well, certainly, from the legal perspective and from the contract perspective, choice of law issues are there, and almost always that's going to be something that's amenable to the licensor. Again, it goes back to the leverage issue. So you're not going to have Warner Brothers doing a license that's going to be under Chinese law. It doesn't matter who they're licensing it to. It's going to be under California law, or possibly New York is maybe the only other thing you'll see. Usually, there's provisions in the contract that any translation of the agreement into another language, the English version is the controlling document. In case there's anything that's sort of lost in translation. So logistically, the licensor is going to make sure that it's more open to them wherever the brand is located, and that usually tends to be U.S. From a deal-making perspective and the deal terms perspective, I'll leave it to these guys to discuss.
Yeah, I would just say that we like to collect in U.S. dollars, because we have a little bit more control over the fluctuation of the value of the dollar. The other thing is where it gets really complicated, I think, is if you're doing a deal for a Chinese-only game or maybe a Korean-only game in local language, then from an approvals perspective, first of all, there's nuance to their game development that work there that we're not maybe as familiar with, and also you need someone on staff who can read or speak Chinese or Korean, and otherwise your approvals are going to be like looking at coloring books, you have no idea. So ideally you have a consultant or someone who can be valuable in helping you digest and interpret all the development that's going back and forth.
I have one, actually. I've been around you guys for many, many years and worked in the business of doing deals, and one of the deals that I did, which was a great one, was with Activision and Spider-Man for the console rights. But along the way, you do hit speed bumps, and one of them was the producer, I won't name his name, came back to us, and midway, we were almost done with the game, they said, we're going to give Spider-Man raised webbing. And it threw the developer for a tizzy, right? It became a legal issue at that front, because we did give approvals on the Spider-Man character in the console game, but the producers have a lot of clout, and so does Marvel, and then we had to make the change. What do you do from a legal perspective after you've always, you've put all those man hours, time into the project? What happens in the legal side?
Well, if you don't have a clause like we were talking about earlier, that something that was previously approved stays approved, I think the licensee is going to be in a real tough spot there. But at least if you've built the agreement right, they have the potential to say, well, great, it's going to be $200,000 worth of extra costs. What are you going to do about that licensor? I'm not just going to eat that, right? Because I've already got an approved asset. That becomes an issue of your indemnification sometimes in the agreement, and the obligations there. So hopefully at that point, regardless of what the contract says, because the licensor will still have a very heavy hand, you've built a good enough working relationship where you guys can solve that outside of the contract. Because something like that, it's probably not going to get solved by the letter of the word.
Right. And I think that's where, when you're on the business side, the business people have a tough job of managing upwards in their companies. In some cases, if you own your own company, you have to talk to an outside IP owner. Yeah, it gets very complicated. And I think that's where licensing maybe scares a lot of people. But I would say, in the end, it's very well worth it if you surround yourself with great people, get the deals done, do it effectively. You can certainly make a lot of money. So I'd like to give a round of applause for the group. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.